John Brown's a very unique figure in American history. He's from upstate New York. In fact, if you're driving to races in Lake Placid, you'll go by his homestead. If you look carefully, you'll see a sign, a New York State historic sign for his homestead. He is a man who feels that God has destined him to take up the cause of abolition in the United States. He is sure of this, and he and his sons travel across the nation, first to Kansas in the Potawatomi raids, and it's a bloody massacre that he feels that God has preordained him to execute in more than one way of the use of that word. And he does execute whites in the state of Kansas, and he is part of the ongoing trend of violence within Kansas, which leads the territory and the time to be called Bleeding Kansas. He eventually comes back to the east and organizes a raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is a military arsenal. And what his plan is overall is to break into this arsenal, take the arms, arm the slaves, and then with arms, meaning guns, etc., and black powder and all that, that slaves will rise up and against their owners, and slavery will, by effect, be abolished. An important figure of the time is also Harriet Beecher Stowe. She is important for her great work, Uncle Tom's Cabin. She is also noteworthy because she is a woman, and she's a diminutive figure, 5'2" or so. Her husband is a full professor at Bowdoin, which is a center of free thinking and liberal thought of the time in Maine. And she writes this, it's the first time that it's really been put out there in form about what is daily slave life like. And it moves many people in the North to recognize that the institution, this peculiar institution of slavery, needs to be looked at and it needs to end. Of her, Lincoln said as she visited the White House, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." So Harriet Beecher Stowe figures prominently into this discussion. Now, Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln, you really can't speak of the two without speak of one without speaking of the other. Recall that there is the Missouri Compromise created a line of the 3630 above which there was agreed that there would be no slavery. Now, subsequent to the Mexican War, there was the Gadsden Purchase of 1853. The reason for the Gadsden Purchase is almost solely so that there can be located a transcontinental railroad in the South. In the person who in the administration and on the Senate floor who was driving this is Jefferson Davis. It is not only the person, but he is instrumental in this. And Douglas and Pierce, who on the left here, as you see, are being accused of forcing slavery into areas that perhaps may not want slavery. And part of the reason I bring up the Gadsden Purchase and the Transcontinental Railroad is if things are moving west and with this great technology, then slaves are going to be able to move forth with them, and of course they're chattel, and of course they should be able to move with them. Stephen Douglas has a wonderful past. It's very interesting. In fact, he's born in Brandon, Vermont. He moves west and becomes a lawyer, and eventually establishes himself as a very prominent political figure in Illinois politics. Eventually, being a U.S. Senator, he eventually has eyes on the White House. Of this, there is no doubt. In between his Senate seat and the White House is Abraham Lincoln and the growing issue of slavery. The slavery extension issue was reopened by Senator Douglas in a bill organizing the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. And Douglas proposes this. He proposes this phrase, popular sovereignty. And by doing so, he says, one, that in any territory that the people there should be able to dictate or vote or in some way determine how they want to deal with slavery. However, this bill effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So, and this act establishes the doctrine of congressional non-intervention in the territories. Wrap your head around this. It means we're going to give up as Congress because we now say it's popular sovereignty. And this bill passed in 1854. Douglas, his motives for sponsoring this? Well, to be honest with you, I think he does believe in self-government. I think that he also has politics in mind. Of this there is no doubt, and he wants to court Southerners for his presidential ambitions. His conviction that by force of geography and nature, if you do some reading on some primary source reading, I think he believes that territories by and far in the north would remain free soil, that by geography and nature of the task, meaning cotton, that slavery will contain itself. This leads to incredible social discord and fighting in the territory of Kansas, which comes to be known as Bleeding Kansas. Because think about, at the time, how are you going to keep people out in the 1850s that are pro-slavery or pro-abolition? It's not popular. And what they did was they just flooded the territory of Kansas. They fought, and people like John Brown, crazies like John Brown, came in, fought against each other. Now, I'm going to simplify this. The issues of the constitutions of the Kansas territory to become a state. This is convoluted, so I want to simplify this for you and talk about two of them. First is the Topeka Constitution, which is drawn up in 1855 and prohibited slavery. For political reasons, President Pierce placed himself in opposition to this because he wants to run for president again, and he wants the support of the South. Okay? Now, at the same time, in 1856, what is ongoing is debate about Kansas within the Senate. During one of these debates, a Senator, Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, talks about the crime against Kansas. And he is speaking on the Senate floor about this and how awful it is, and he criticizes a fellow senator. That senator's cousin, Preston Brooks, who is in the House of Representatives, hears about this, crosses literally into the Senate chamber, and proceeds to beat Sumner with a metal-tipped cane, causing him to be hospitalized for 3 months. Excuse me, it's not his cousin, it's his nephew, sorry. This speech came to be known as the crime against Kansas. Going back to the constitutional issues, the second, it's not really the second, but I'm going to simplify this. The second constitution written for Congress is the Lecompton Constitution. It's a town in Kansas. The details of this is a pro-slavery constitution, and basically how this goes through is that says that the convention drafted a special article, if you read here, on slavery, which alone was to be submitted to popular vote. The article guaranteed the right of property in holding a slave, and if rejected, slavery would no longer exist, but the right of property in slaves would not be abolished, which is a rather innovative way of going about this. President Buchanan, because he also wants re-election, and again, look at the date on this, he agreed to the Lecompton Constitution in principle. This caused Douglas to denounce both the Lecompton Constitution and Buchanan in Congress, and however, the Senate voted to admit Kansas with the Constitution in 1858. So the real point here of going through this discussion of these constitutions is this, that politically, Buchanan is trying to do something, get reelected. Douglas is trying to do something politically by getting elected to his Senate seat, but in long term, he's looking to the 1860 election and wants to make sure that he doesn't alienate himself from the South. and at the same time make sure that he doesn't anger Northerners in free states by standing very carefully with one foot in both the camps, slavery and non-slavery. Um, Douglas, by virtue of his popular sovereignty, denounces the Lecompton Constitution and Buchanan while in Congress. Um, and so it sets up this political debate for the 1860 situation of the presidential election. Now, I'll go ahead very briefly here and go to another slide. And this will be a cause for the next video. But what comes along next is the Supreme Court decision, Scott versus Sandford, in the Dred Scott case, 1857. So this further complicates things quite a bit in this decision.